Hunter x Hunter chapter 407 is here, so let's dive straight into it. And if you're not caught up, I got a playlist on my page to get you caught up, so lock in. All right, spoilers beware. The chapter begins right where we left off amidst Ninth Prince Halkenburg's funeral procession. We have his pallbearers carrying the casket through the ship up toward Tier 1, with soldiers lining either side to protect it, and thousands upon thousands of people gathered to pay their final respects. This is chapter 407 titled Negotiations, with the editor's note, Halkenburg's funeral, the people's grief is immeasurable. And comment down below how long it took you to find me in this one. 90% of the next page is just this gorgeous single panel of Halkenburg's pallbearers carrying the casket up this massive staircase between the two tiers. It's absolutely beautiful. And then we get a bird's eye view of the black whale and find out that it is Thursday at 1 p.m. on the 12th day of this expedition. We then transition to a scene with 5 guards, and it's these 5 pictured here, minus Borkson, the one in the middle. And if you don't recall, these 5 are members of Chrollo's personal army, and they're actually his childhood friends as well. We were introduced to them back in chapter 394 when they were investigating some of the things going on with the Haley on Tier 3. So until we find out anything that points to the contrary, I would assume that this scene is taking place on Tier 3. And they're not currently amidst all of the to-do for Halkenburg's funeral procession because that has moved on past Tier 3 at this point. So they are in a public area and there are still a lot of people around, but they're just gathered speaking to one another. And as a bit more of a refresher, back in chapter 394 when we last saw them, they had gotten Borkson reassigned to meet up with them, so all 6 of them were together, and they were discussing how they could best serve and protect Chrollo, specifically in reference to how they knew Morena Prudhoe, the leader of the Haley, was coming after him. So we pick up on Tier 3 with the 5 of these on the outside. Alright, so just for the record, we don't know 3 of these characters' names yet, so I'm going to give them nicknames for simplicity's sake, and I'll also hover over who's speaking. So we pick up with Atosin saying that, hey, Borkson is missing. Guile then responds and says, yeah, her last communication was right before the funeral procession. Mamoli chimes in and says, and that was 30 minutes ago. Squiggles then says, well, maybe she had a sudden reassignment or was tracking someone suspicious. And Guile says, we agreed to report anything unusual and not just at a scheduled time. So if something changed, there's no reason she wouldn't have contacted us. Mamoli then says, right, so we should assume the worst then. Borkson must have been abducted. But by whom and what's their motive? Pretty Boy then chimes in and says, she's a soldier and we're on a mission. How could she have been taken without a struggle and without anyone noticing? Momoli then says, it could have been a team of multiple people. The more that were working together, the easier it would have been. Like, let's say they just all surrounded her in a crowd to obscure everyone else's vision, and then somebody knocked her out with the drug. That would have been really easy in a crowd this size. Pretty Boy then chimes in and says, or it could have just been a familiar face, like a fellow soldier, and then he could have pulled it off on his own. Like, he could have lured her to the hospital by feigning an illness, and then when they got close, he could have had a bunch of accomplices lying in wait. Atosin then chimes in and says, and what if they're using Nin abilities? If that's the case, they might be able to just control her like straight up hypnosis. What if the Haley abducted Borkson with Nin abilities so that they can use her in an assassination attempt on Chrollo? And then Guile says, so there are plenty of possibilities here, but for the worst case scenario, it's just as Momoli suggested. And Squiggles says, as Borkson anticipated, if one of us is captured, are we really going to go with the no contact for negotiations and no rescue attempts? And then somebody chimes in up above them, another guard, and he says, hey, what are you guys doing over there all standing together talking? Like, do your job, keep your distance, and stay on guard. The special security alert is still in effect. So the 5 of them decide to just think this over and decide what they should do as they split up and go secure the perimeter. We then transition to a full page, no dialogue, where we just see Morena sitting across from Borkson. So she had indeed been abducted by the leader of the Haley. And I just gotta real quick say, I hope you're tuned in, I hope you're following, I hope you're subscribed, because if so, you would have already known this was gonna happen because we put out a video last week talking about how this is exactly who Morena was looking for. So we pick up with this conversation and Morena says, welcome to the Haley hideout. And Borkson responds, well, I presume that must make you Morena Prudhoe then. Why have you brought me here? And Morena says, well, I hope that we can become allies. It's not that we have to, but there is a good reason for it. And to use an analogy, it's as if we need an organ and you are a matching organ donor. We intend to do everything we can to convince you to join our side. We then see that Borkson's internal thoughts are that she's not restrained and there's 6 enemies around her, but her weapon has been confiscated. So out loud she says, well, that depends on the conditions. I can't give you an immediate answer. And then internally she says, I can't remember anything though. This isn't a typical abduction. It seems like they used some sort of power on me and that's why I can't remember anything. Was it an inability? Morena then says, it's wise to avoid answering yes or no, but please understand that the more I explain, the less likely it is that our side will be able to change what's to come. And Borkson says, what do you mean by that? Is that a threat? And Morena says, well, I guess it depends on how you interpret it. I can't go into specifics, but the longer this goes on, the more dangerous it becomes for both sides. And Borkson says, well, that sure is convenient for you. And Morena says, you're not wrong, but you shouldn't expect any decency from criminals like us. It's at this point that Morena whips out a deck of cards, and she says, I know this is complicated, but in order to make this as smooth as possible and give you some agency in this decision, I've decided that we could settle this with a game of negotiation. This will be my first and last concession, but if you retire from this game, you will lose all freedom except for the ability to say yes and no. And Borkson says, okay, well, I'll listen for now. Explain this game to me. Morena then starts laying cards out on the table, some face down, some face up. And we see that these aren't a typical deck of playing cards, but instead it's like a card set for a board game, and different ones have different symbols on them. And Morena says, this is a game where a parent asks a question to their child, and it continues until the child is left with an answer. As the parent, I have 7 cards that are all placed face up. As the child, you have 5 cards that are all placed face down. The child will select one of the parent's cards first, and the parent responds. Then the card goes to the graveyard. Next, the parent selects one of the child's cards and turns it face up. The card then goes to the graveyard. This process is repeated, and in the end, the child's last remaining card is the answer to the request. So Borkson says, okay, so the child has 4 yes cards and 1 no card. And Morena says, please turn them over starting from the left side. And so Borkson starts to do so. The first card she turns over says yes. The second card says no. The third card she turns over has 2 R symbols on it. And so Borkson asks, what does this mean? And Morena says that's the R card. You can use it to select 1 card from the child's graveyard and return it to your hand. So, in other words, if the R card stays in your hand the entire time, then at the end of the game, you can exchange it for whichever answer you want, yes or no. So Borkson nods her head and then flips over the 4th card, which is a joker. And Morena says the joker can transform into either yes or no. So it's the similar situation. If that's your last card, you can also exchange it for whatever answer you want. It's at this point that Borkson says, so this game is just for show, right? And Morena says, what makes you say that? And Borkson says, well, earlier you said if I refused to play the game, then I would only be allowed to say yes or no, and all other freedoms would be taken away. However, this game is seemingly presenting me with the only option of yes or no. So what's the point of playing the game? And Morena says, turn over the next card. Borkson does, and she sees a card with the X symbol on it. And Morena says, the X card is neither yes or no. It means you don't have to give an answer. So Borkson says, so if this is my last card, does that mean I can render the whole game invalid? And Morena says, that's exactly right. If you have the X card, you can leave here without answering yes or no. And we won't force negotiations upon you again after that, even if we have the opportunity to do so. I promise you that. We then get a close-up panel of both of their eyes, and Morena says, but on the other hand, if the end of the game ends in a yes or a no, then you have to take full responsibility for that answer. Are you okay with this? Borkson kind of pauses and just looks at her and is like, chill out. And she says, you haven't even finished explaining the rules yet, so no, I can't give you a definitive answer. But she then thinks to herself and thinks that from the explanation I've gotten so far of this game, it's obvious that it's not going to work in my favor at all. Because at first glance, with only one of my 5 cards being a yes, You would think that that would put me in an advantageous position. I have 4 ways to say no potentially, but that's a trap, I think. And if we just consider the yes card, if I end the game with that, then that means I will have to become her ally and basically follow all of her rules. That would be a complete and total defeat. But what if I end up with the no card and it's actually just as bad? No might seem like the good answer from this point, but I actually don't know the true nature of this game yet. I really have to figure out what Morena's cards do and what they mean. Borkson continues and says, the explanation of this game may play out in such a way that unfortunate things will happen to me if I end up saying no. And that could be their strategy to get me to think, well, maybe I'm better off by just picking yes. But based on that, the no and the joker become pointless along with the yes. Meaning my only true options would be the R card and the X card, which is 2 out of 5 or 40%. And you might think that that's not that bad, but that's the second trap. Because how many of these cards are truly in my favor? And honestly, it doesn't even matter, because in a system where the parent gets to select the child's cards, they can cheat as much as they want. Morena then says, well, all right then, let me continue the explanation with what my cards do. And Borkson thinks to herself, but the third trap is the worst of them all. Morena then points to her first card, which has an arrow hitting a bullseye, and she says, this is the purpose card. If you select this card, I will explain my purpose to you. The purpose of bringing you here, the purpose of recruiting you as an ally, and I'll try to be as concise as possible. But if you have any questions about this purpose, I will gladly explain further, so please listen carefully. The next card is the power card, and this one has a flexing arm on it. She says, if you select this card, I will explain my ability to you. It may be beyond what you can comprehend, but I will explain it truthfully and with no deception. And as long as it's about my ability, I will go over it as many times as it takes for you to be satisfied. However, I have to reiterate that the longer this goes on, the more dangerous it becomes for both of us. So please forgive me if I speak quickly. The next card is the question A card, and she points to one with a Q and an A on it. She says, for any questions you have, however many, whatever they are, I'll answer as many as you need. However, I won't answer any questions about my purpose or my ability. To know that, you have to select those cards. And I can only give you 3 answers to any question you ask me. Those 3 answers are yes, no, or yes and no. Morena then points to the next card, which says QB on it, and she says, if you want to know more about a question that you asked during the question A card, you must select the question B card on your next turn. Then, as long as it fits within the scope of the question, I will explain all until your doubts are resolved. So basically how this one works is, on question A, you can only ask questions with yes or no answers. But if you want a more in-depth explanation on something, you have to use question B to follow up on it. But Morena continues, be careful though, because only the very last question you ask during question A can be asked about with question B. So be careful with how you finish your question A turn. And Borkson says, okay, I understand. She then thinks to herself that I don't really need yes or no questions from Morena, because based on her gestures, expressions, and tone of voice, I can pretty much tell what she's thinking. So out loud, she then says, there's something I'd like to confirm about how we answer these yes or no questions. So would it be okay to do a quick test question? And Morena says, sure, let's hear it. So Borkson says, you won't cheat in this game, yes or no? And Morena kind of shoots her a look and says, okay, so you're suggesting that we agree on a pattern for how we're going to respond to negatively framed questions. That's definitely important to figure out because we don't want any misunderstandings to happen. So, for example, if I asked you something like, didn't you do it? Then most people would say, no, I didn't do it. But there are some cultures, some regions out there where they would instead respond, yeah, I didn't do it. So we should probably figure that out. And a couple of the guards have a quick little like peanut gallery back and forth where they're like, yeah, people that respond, yes, I didn't do it are completely crazy. And one of the other person was like, yeah, sorry, I do that. I didn't realize it was strange. Meanwhile, Borkson is thinking to herself that this game seems to serve as both a rite of passage for recruitment, but also an interview process. Morena is likely using this conversation to observe me, observe my personality, intelligence, and suitability as an ally. But then out loud, she says, "So, what's your answer then, Morena? How are we doing this?" And Morena says, "No, I won't cheat at all." So that is the pattern we will use to respond to those types of questions. Morena then says, "Does that work for you as well?" And Borkson says, "Yes." But Borkson then thinks to herself, just what in the world has this woman this angry? Because Borkson can feel the emotion behind the fake smile and dead eyes. But she also thinks to herself, okay, Morena's not going to cheat here. Based on her demeanor and her attitude and that of her subordinates, I think I can rest assured that that's not what's going to happen. There will be no cheating. Morena then continues and says, okay, let's move on to the next cards, the yes card and the no card. How these work is once you're down to your last card, the game is going to end, and you're either going to have a yes or a no. At that point, I will explain in detail what that means. But if you want to know something before that, you're going to have to select one of these question cards. So how I'm understanding this is once the game is over, let's just say hypothetically Borkson is left with the yes card. Then and only then is Morena going to explain what she wants from her. She's going to explain what it means for them to ally up and all that jazz, right? So if Borkson wants to know some of those details before the game ends, she'll have to use the yes question card. And similarly, if she wants to know the details of what happens should the game end on a no, she has to use the no question card. Morena then continues and points to the very last card, which has a D on it. And she says, this is the deal card. If there's a card you desperately want to bring back from the graveyard, you pick this one. And in return for fulfilling a small request, I'll get it for you. But after hearing the details of this small request, if you don't want to do it anymore, you don't have to. You can decline. However, if you decline, then I will take the turn to draw a card, and the deal card will go to the graveyard. So please keep that in mind. You basically only get one chance to do this exchange. Morena then says, the game ends when you're down to your last card. So the last chance you have to select this card is going to be when you have 2 cards remaining. So just remember that. Morena then looks to Borkson and says, all right, so would you like to play this game of negotiations? And Borkson says, I'll play under one condition. I'm the one who gets to decide what to pick from the face down cards on the child side. Is that okay with you? And Morena says, that's fine. I've actually allowed that a few times already. And if it's okay with you, I'll take care of the shuffling. And Borkson agrees. Morena then says, all right, let's begin. And that's where chapter 407 of Hunter x Hunter ends. We do get the editor's note. Borkson and Morena start their game of negotiations. And I actually really enjoyed this chapter, even though it was basically just one long scene. We got this Morena, Borkson back and forth, and then also the Saridnik army guys quick little scene. But I'm here for it. I'm really fascinated by Morena. And in particular, one of the last things she said there about having allowed it a few times already in reference to the child deck getting to pick the cards. Makes you wonder, who else did she play this game with, and who else might she have on her side? Hisoka comes to mind, which I've talked about a little bit, but also Kaiser. I haven't made a video about that idea yet, but I wonder if Kaiser might be working with the Haley as well. But anyways, y'all, let me know your thoughts. I'll be putting out more videos across the week with in-depth dives on certain things, as always. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.